morning, everyone. Welcome to another webinar here hosted by Affinity Management with the great pleasure of having Lisa Miguel from Kane and Bender. Thank you all for attending today. Today, we're talking about the new SIRS, well, not new any longer, but the requirement for the structural integrity reserves, going over any particular questions that you may have. We're at the tail end of the beginning of it, so we're excited and nervous at the same time. Lisa and I were talking about a bit earlier. But we're glad to see that many associations are moving things along. So we do have the Q&A open, so feel free to put any questions that you may have. Lisa or myself will do our best to get to those questions if they're related to today's topic. If not, we'll have a contact information provided after the fact for both Lisa and her team, as well as Affinity and our team. And that way we can try to address any particular concerns. So welcome again to today's webinar. Lisa, if you want to say a few little things about yourself and the firm.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for having me today. I'm glad we're talking about the SIRS requirements and what you can do last minute year-end planning. My name is Lisa Miguel. I'm board certified attorney in condominium and planned unit development law. I'm also a member or fellow of the College of Community Association Lawyers, which is a national organization. Less than 200 people have been admitted to the college. So it's something that I'm proud of. I work with Bender and Rambound. We have offices throughout the state, including the Tampa area, the Orlando area, Palm Beach area, and Broward County, but we service community associations throughout the state. And we've been working very hard with our clients to ensure that not only that they comply with the milestone inspection requirements, but their structural integrity reserve requirements, and prompting them to make sure that they take advantage of whatever opportunities there are this year, because they're no longer available next year.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lisa. I know you and your firm do an excellent job, especially in the space of educating and providing knowledge. So we're honored to have you on here today. As for ourselves, my name is Rafael Aquino. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Affinity Management Services. We're a community association management company. Really what differentiates us here is that we're focused on our three proven processes: align, execute, deliver, helping our associations really, our board members execute the vision that they have. And I'm sure for many of the board members and managers on their call right now, the vision is to get this SIRS requirement completed. So our focus has been highly on that the past few months. So we're excited to do this webinar. And again, the Q&A is open, so feel free to chime in with any questions that you may have. So I want to start with the first question here, Lisa, that we get asked many times, which is with regards to the structural integrity reserves. Now we're in the midst, if not, hopefully you're at the end of budget season. The question has been do they separate the structural integrity reserves? Are they a separate pool? And how do you recommend associations to manage it?
Okay, all great questions. And it depends on whether or not you have reserves already. If you do have reserves, whether in their straight line reserves, whether they're pooled reserves. So let's talk about this from like a 30,000 foot perspective. You're going to have your reports. Your report should have a structural integrity reserve report and a non-structural integrity reserve report. So you know all the things that are mandatory funding on the SIRS side, and then also mandatorily included in your budget on the non-structural side, but you have the ability to waive. Then you're going to take a look at what funds you have available. If you have funds available in straight line reserves, you may be able to, with the board approval only, move the straight line reserve funds into a pool for the structural integrity, so long as that category is part of the structural integrity reserves. If you have pooled reserves, I think it's a little bit more difficult to determine how to allocate those funds between the structural integrity and the non-structural reserves. Plus, depending on what your mandatory funding requirements will be, you may want to front load or put as much money as you can into the structural integrity side to reduce your minimum fund or your mandatory funding obligations. So to do that, if you're going to change the use of any reserves, or you're going to move items from a pool into a different pool, or otherwise move straight line items that were dedicated to other reserve components into a pool for structural integrity, you need a vote of the owners. And this is the last year you can do that with respect to structural reserves. So In order to calculate your funding requirements, you need to know what money is already in there. If you can have your members vote to move that money in there and then calculate what your minimum funding will be for 2025. Now, this is also the last year that you have the option of allowing your members to vote to waive the SIRS reserves, the mandatory structural
Hmm.
reserves. And that vote requires the approval of a majority of the entire membership. In the past, well, 2 years ago and there before, um, it was only required to have a vote of majority of the owners. I mean, I'm sorry, the majority of the quorum participating at
Yeah,
the meeting. Now it's a majority of the owners. So if you do have a community where people are somewhat apathetic or maybe not as in tune with what's going on, you want to hold that meeting earlier rather than later because you want to have the opportunity to make sure that you obtain the vote that you need in order to waive those reserves for the 2025 year.
correct. Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, especially when you're talking about maybe 80 units, not as hard that you need 41 votes. But when you're talking about your 300, 400 unit condos, that becomes very challenging, especially with what you see down here in South Florida, where many are either investor owned and those investors are in other countries. And it's very difficult to get the proxies unless you have electronic voting and so forth. So if you're considering that, it's important to do that now. And with what you told me, I think what's important to note for both the CAMs and the boards on this call is if you're looking to, do any changes with the reserves, or if you're not too sure of your reserves, you need to have those phone calls. Similar, like if you own your own business, you need to call in the CPA, call in the accountant, call in the attorney, so that you have a clear understanding of what direction you're going to take, and you have, that information that's needed in order for you to make the right decision. Many times they want to save some money. Well, let's not call the attorney, let's not call the CPA. But the truth is that in these kinds of decisions, we need the professionals to help us so that if we need to take a vote of the membership to move some of those reserves into structural integrity reserve component section, then at least we're following the business judgment rule, and we're having the opinions from the attorney as well as the CPA on how to move these things along without just doing it saying that this is the way that it could be done. And
Exactly. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And plus, you raised another important point that is the electronic voting. With people being all over the place, I mean, especially think about the people on the west coast of Florida.
yeah,
If you're in a property where you're displaced, you're not going to receive your mail. But if you have the electronic voting, you can log on from wherever you are, or many of the voting platforms have the ability to use it remotely on your phone, what have you. Then you or your owners still have the opportunity to participate in the vote. And this is a vote that you have to have before the end of the year. Proxies, are only good for up to 90 days
90
from the
days.
date of the original meeting. So that electronic voting option may give you the push that you need in order to get the number of affirmative votes that are necessary for you to move forward with whatever you want to do financially for your particular community. We also
Correct.
talked about, the whether or not it's advisable to vote to waive this first year. And obviously, it depends on the financial wherewithal of your members, what you think they can tolerate. Will they be able to tolerate it better next year? Is it insurmountable? But what we talked about just a little bit earlier is that also can depend upon what's in your reserve schedule. So if some of you out there have your roofs are due next year or in 2026, or major other projects are due in the next 2 years, well, maybe it's worthwhile to waive for 2025, get that work done in 2025, either by obtaining a loan or a special assessment, and then you're going to recalculate your mandatory funding for 2026. So that's something to really think about, and you have to
Yeah.
do that now because you have to set up the votes that you need in order to do that.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation, Lisa. I know we were talking a little bit about it beforehand, and that could make a major difference, right? If you're going to fix the roof come January next year, Right now, I'm sure the structural integrity reserves just says, okay, it's the full amount of the roof. So you need to have that full amount by the end of the year. But if you know as a board that you're going to make that change next year, that's a great suggestion on your part to make sure that you waive it this year so that next year you get that reset and you start fresh. I want to answer the question here from Jim. Jim asked, to be clear, are we able to waive the structural integrity reserves for 2025 if done before December 31st, 2024?
Yes.
Yep.
So perfectly clear, you can, if you vote and have the vote completed before December 31, 2024, everything is disclosed, yes, you're able to waive for the 2025 fiscal year, assuming that you're on the January 1 through December 31 fiscal year.
Yeah.
I have some
Excellent
clients
point.
that
Yeah.
are on a fiscal year that's a little bit different, so they had to adopt their budget in May, let's just say, or in April, for a May through April fiscal year, they were able to waive for that fiscal year. But then, of course, in May, when they need a new budget, they're no longer able to waive because it'll
Yeah.
be adopted after 12/31/24.
That's correct. What I would recommend, at least from a management side, if that's something that you're looking to do, just make sure that you're communicating to your residents, not just sending the waive, okay, we're just going to waive the structural integrity reserves. I highly recommend drafting a letter that this is something that's going to be required. We're doing it for X, Y, Z reasons. If it's because you're going to do a roof next year, or because you're in the midst of finishing up a large project and everything will reset in 2025, and that's why you're doing it, or if it's because, as Lisa mentioned earlier, association, it's going to be too much at one time. I do recommend highly communicating to the residents of why you're doing it, what the expectations are, because technically it's coming next year, no matter what. If you waive it, you're going to pass it in the following year's budget. So it's important that you at least let them understand where it's coming from so that they can prepare if that's why you're doing it. And that way it's not a big surprise in the coming year, because it's going to come one way or another. The bill is going to be due, as many of us have seen. There hasn't been a special session. There's talks about one after the election, but there hasn't been one. So it doesn't look like there's going to be any change. So right now, the right thing to do is to pass it if you have the ability to do it, in my opinion. If you can't, then make sure you take the votes and possibly maybe pass a little something over so at least they know, okay, this is just a fractional amount of what's to come in the coming year. And I wanted to ask you, Lisa, with regards to, let's say, those associations that have their structural integrity reserves completed, how have you seen your clients addressing, let's say, the gap that they have between what's needed for structural integrity and what they currently have? Are you seeing more special assessments? And can associations do it either special assessment or through a loan as well?
A lot of the reserve reports I'm seeing do contemplate a special assessment for the first year in order to bring the reserves up to a certain level. I want everyone to understand that even if you did a special assessment to like pre-fund or beef up the funding in the structural integrity reserve area, your accounts, it's not going to eliminate the need to fund based upon your budget or however you collect your budget on a monthly or quarterly basis. So let's just say the roof is due in 2026. It's going to cost, look, easy numbers, 200,000. You don't want to collect 200,000 in 2 years via your monthly or your quarterly payment. So you do an upfront assessment for the 100,000. You're going to have 100,000 now in that account, but you're still that next 2 years need to fund the remaining 100,000 so that by 2026 or whenever the bill is due, you'll have enough money in the reserve account to fund that actual project. So it's six one half dozen the other, in my opinion. That's why I recommended maybe waiving for this first year to do the special assessment and get that work done. There's no need for an association that's underfunded unless you have work in that 1, 2, 3 year period, maybe 4-year period, depending on the cost. You don't have to use a special assessment to beef up your fund. You can just collect enough money on a monthly or quarterly basis so that you have the funds available when the work is due. And that's a financial decision that is, important to make with your management team, depending on what other projects you have in mind and what other cash flow issues you have. So both of them are viable options. I was surprised to see many of the reserve reports suggesting a special assessment as opposed to just funding like normal reserve funding.
Yeah, yeah. What we've seen is a similar thing. We've seen a little bit of back and forth differences in the way it gets approached. I know some associations, they don't want anything to do with a loan, so they just want, okay, what our catch up is, special assessment. Obviously, those are a little bit more affluent communities, where they just want to get it caught up. And an important point to address as well is, many times we had board members that were thinking, okay, so we have to be fully funded for everything that the reserve study states. And for the structural component, it's really up to what the useful life is what they use to determine. So if you had 5 years left, it doesn't mean you need to have the full amount of what it's going to cost in 5 years. It's the buildup towards that. So, many people had that confusion that, oh, okay, if it costs $100,000 to repair the AC, it's $100,000 I have to have. No, it's what you need today to get to that 100,000. So that provided a big alleviation. I know when the statute first came out, everyone panicked about that itself, and then there were some clarifications there as well. Now, I do want to bring up the important point. So we know that structural integrity reserves are required. You have the ability of waiving it this year, assuming you get the majority of the owners in the association to approve it. Let's talk about those non-structural integrity reserves. Are those going to be required to be waived every single year, or are people just going to say, well, I have my structural integrity reserves, I don't have to worry about the rest?
No. The regular reserve rules are still in place. So when it comes to the non-structural integrity reserves, your pool furniture and your pool pump and all of the other things that you need to fund, it's the same rule that's always been in place. Anything that's going to cost more than $10,000 for deferred maintenance or replacement goes into the schedule. Yes, the owners will still have the ability to waive, but they can only waive for the year in which the funding is due. So if you're voting on the 2025 budget, you're only waiving for the 2025 budget. Same thing going forward. In 2026, you're not going to have the ability to waive the structural items, but you still can, and if you so desire, can put on the agenda a vote to waive the non-structural reserves. That doesn't mean that you stop disclosing them too.
Yeah,
Remember, now you have these reports, everybody,
that's right.
and even
That's right.
for the communities that only have the two-story buildings or one-story buildings, you still have these disclosure requirements. Please do not forget to include fully funded reserve schedules in your budget every year. And for those low-rise condominiums, at least you have the ability to waive all of it, should you so desire. That may not be the right financial choice for your community, but in the buildings that are 3 stories or higher, the structural are going to be ingrained in stone into your budget, and then the board will have flexibility to decide whether or not they want to have the members vote to waive or reduce the non-structural funding.
Yeah, and really depending on your association, you're going to find that a very high percentage of it is structural integrity reserves. Obviously, depending on what amenities you have within your building. So it may be just easier just to get the whole thing approved, because you're going to notice it could be a small portion. With some buildings with big higher end amenities and so forth, those components can push it up. But ultimately, I think the positive light of all this legislation is, number one, we're going to have much safer buildings. Number two, we're going to have boards that are not going to hesitate now to make the right decision for the community, because the funds are going to be there. Number three, you can no longer grab those pooled reserves to update the lobby instead of getting the building concrete restoration done or building paint done. So it's a difficult moment right now for all of us in the industry, at least for those buildings that didn't have any kind of reserves. But ultimately, I think 2 to 3 years down the line, as I said prior to the call, can't wait to get over this. We'll be in a much better position. I know it'll be easier for us in its own way to manage the property, because having the money's always been the challenge a majority of the times.
Right now, you're exactly right. And that's the whole intent of the law. The whole intent of the law is to, number one, provide the board with a little bit of cover. When you're on a board and you have a professional engineer or a professional contractor saying that, your roof really needs to be done, and you have owners yelling at you that say, oh, no, just patch it, just patch it, just patch it. Now the board can say, well, listen, our reserve study says our roof is due in 2027, so we need to do our roof in 2027. Plus, having those funds available will make it a lot easier for those boards, even if you do need to do like a gap assessment because, pricing comes out a little bit differently, or you have other contingencies that you want to add in. Again, the whole purpose of this law is to make buildings safer and to enable the board of directors to fulfill their fiduciary duties to maintain, repair, and replace the condominium property, particularly the portions of the property that if not maintained, could result in personal injuries and significant damages to the unit owners and themselves and to the board members themselves.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, listen, we've seen several buildings. No one gets happy about it or applauds it, but we've seen several buildings that have been shut down. So there's been, imagine if these laws didn't pass, many of these buildings, we could have had that same unfortunate circumstance that we had with the Champlain Tower. So there have been benefits from it. I have a question here from Alan. Alan asked, can non-structural integrities be included in the SIRS funds?
Well, let me try to rephrase the question. So if you're collecting money, obviously you can collect structural and non-structural. If you're talking about like physically where the money goes, it's not required by law to separate those funds into different accounts or different pools. I just find that it's easier for a board. And especially, you may change management, you may change accounting firms, things change over time. You may change whoever's doing your year-end audits. I think it's easier for a board to keep the fund separate. So when you're spending the money, it's
Yeah.
100% perfectly clear what you're allowed to use that money for. But if you're talking about like, can the non-structural be included in the structural? If you're thinking about waiving, then you don't have to waive all of it. So say the non-structural, you have pool pump and elevators and tennis courts and whatever, and you only want to waive the tennis courts because you're going to have to redo your pool pump next year. Go ahead and have the members vote on those specific reductions or those specific waivers. But if you're talking about where the money physically is held, it can be all held in one bank account. It's just the
That's
way
right.
that you are accounting for it. And
Yeah.
in my opinion, as I said, I'll just say it again, if it's in two different pools, I think it's just easier because you cannot spend X amount of dollars on anything other than what is called for in the structural reserves.
Yeah, that's correct. And really depending if you're working with someone that's an expert in our industry and has the experience within our industry, our experience has shown us that the newer reserves are especially the structural integrity reserve study, they're normally broken down into, okay, here are your structural components and here are your other components, because it didn't make sense just to get a structural integrity reserves. At least for our clients, we recommended let's get the full boat so you understand where you're at, and you can make the right decision for your community, not just only do the structural integrity that's required. That way, again, at least from the management standpoint and from a leadership standpoint, I believe as a board member, because as a board member, you're a leader, is you want to communicate that if you are going to waive it, listen, we may have a special assessment outside of these increased reserves for these components because we've decided to waive the reserves. So it's important that you're communicating whatever decisions you're making. Obviously, as a board member, you're appointed to this position to make decisions on behalf of the associations, but it's equally as important to make sure that you're communicating these big decisions so that if something happens down the line or people aren't out of the blue just saying, as using Lisa's example of the tennis court, there's a crack and we need to fix it, that they're not surprised by a special assessment because you just don't have the reserves for those particular component.
Yeah, I'll tell you something. What you just said, I haven't seen any of my clients solely obtain a structural integrity reserve
Yeah.
report. I mean, of course, they're going to do a reserve report for all components, and they just have two different schedules because, one can be waived and one is mandatory. But not only for your planning purposes as a board and as on the management team, but for disclosure purposes. It's so important. It's so important for your members to understand what projects are coming due so that they can do whatever they need to do to plan fiscally for increased monthly or quarterly fees or future special assessments. It's also really important for to as a disclosure for purchasers. You want your purchasers to know, to be able to base their purchasing decision on the real affordability factor. If they can afford whatever the monthly fee is, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can afford all the financial obligations
That's right.
associated with ownership. And that was one of the problems that we've saw in the past when reserves have been waived for forever, because it almost lures purchasers into a false sense of and the existing owners into a false sense of complacency, saying, "Oh, it's only $450 a month. I can deal with that. That's not a big deal." Well, if you've been waiving the reserves for forever, and now you need to do four, five, six, $10,000 assessment for the roof and concrete restoration and elevators and other important projects, well, that owner is now somewhat could be in a pickle because they weren't anticipating those expenses.
That's right. You're completely right there, and I love that you bring up those points because that's the reality of living in condos. For many times, for not all associations, but for many associations, people would buy in. It's your very emotional purchase, very exciting purchase for many, and you're not paying attention to some of the details. And now, at least this is going to level the playing field for many condos, because sometimes you would look at one condo and say, well, how come they pay 300? How come this one pays 800? Well, this one's fully funded. This one has, and people could never grasp that concept. But I think now this has definitely leveled the playing field, and owners can really understand what the true cost is. Get 80% of the way because you still have the other part that you could waive, but at least people really know what it costs to live in a condo association. I have a great question here from Kevin, and Kevin asks, if you want to move from straight line to pooled funding, is a vote of the board or a vote of the owners?
It's a vote of the owners. I mean, depending on, um, it's always going to be a vote of the owners, because once you take the straight line reserves and put them into a pool, you're changing the use of those funds. So let's just say you have straight line for roof, paving, and painting, which was the primary categories in the statute. If you put that roof, paving, and painting all into one pool, well, now you're using maybe the roof funds. If painting is the first job, maybe you're using some of the roof funds. If roofing is the first job, maybe you're using some of the paving funds. So yes, to move into a pool does require a vote of the owners.
Okay, excellent. I want to follow up here with a question from the Emerald at Brickle, and the question is, the deadline for SIRS is December 31st of this year. They'd like to clarify if signing the proposal for the SIRS compliance, even if the inspection is not completed by the first quarter of 2025, they want to ensure that they still will not receive any fines or penalties by the state.
I can't really assure you of that.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this obligation has been out there for about 2 years now, but I would hope that the division, if you have a contract in place and it's just a matter of scheduling, with your reserve provider, I would hope that the division would be cognizant that of the constraints on the various providers around the state and the community association. So I'm hoping that, won't involve any penalties or negative consequences, but I wouldn't be able to guarantee that, obviously.
Yeah, I agree with you. Ultimately, you want to make sure that you're moving this along. I would definitely make sure if whatever documentation you have of whatever process you went through, whether it's obtaining proposals, if they're telling you that it's taking time to be able to get the proposal, make sure you're documenting that. But I don't think there's anyone that can guarantee that. And I missed an important question here with regards to reporting of the structural integrity reports. Are those required to be turned into the building department, or are they required to be turned to the DBPR? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Actually, I was just going to bring that up too, because within 45 days, you have to distribute the report to your members. You also have to notify the division that you've had Division of Florida Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes, that you've obtained the report. So they did have an email that you would send an email to saying that you have the report, but now there's actually a form online that you can fill out saying that you've received the report and the date of the report. Remember, there are a lot of condominium and cooperative associations in Florida. So yes, DBPR is compiling this information. I would venture to say that any of the activity as far as enforcement on the part of DBPR will be more complaint driven, because compiling all this information and then going through the list of the people who have of the communities that haven't reported is a time consuming process. So for the previous questioner that there's a hope that by the time, if that was Emerald, by the time they got to the E's, maybe they'll already have the report in place, and
Yeah.
maybe they'll be doing something with their budget, and therefore it won't be such a problem. But you don't want to be in the position where your owner is going to turn around and just report you because you didn't get your report, you didn't get your SIRS on time and you never properly waive. So anything you can do to get it within the time constraints is great. Although if you're signing now, again, these things have been scheduled for months, so getting on the schedule is not the easiest thing in the world.
Of course. And that you're aware of, are there any penalties that are within the statute that state if it's not completed, these are the penalties, or it's right now open?
Well, it's a breach of fiduciary duty. Now, that doesn't mean there's a specific penalty, but it's also a violation of the statute. So
Yeah.
yes, I mean, there are finding guidelines for complaints or violations. It's just not specific. Some of it is up to the discretion of the DBPR. And as far as breach of fiduciary duty, if you wanted to raise a complaint through the Florida courts, um, yeah, I don't know if there's a financial benefit to you or financial penalty. It would be more in the nature of a complaint for injunctive relief to require them to
Yeah.
require the association to obtain the report.
Correct. So basically, don't risk it. That's what it
Right,
sounds like to me.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Listen, you never know. I mean, in these communities, you always have, that small group of individuals that sometimes you don't know who they are, and all of a sudden you have complaints. You're having to deal with that. It's not just the fine. You have to keep in mind that you have to get your attorneys involved. You have to get the insurance. It becomes a very complex issue, because many times these things are missed. Like all of a sudden now your manager's having to deal with a potential lawsuit. Now that takes time away from doing other projects that are much more necessary and have a higher priority. But unfortunately, because certain steps weren't taken earlier, now you're having to deal with these other things, and the residents don't see this stuff. But these are things that happen behind closed doors and management offices, and it becomes very cumbersome. So that's why it's important to try to get ahead of the game, so that you're not falling behind and trying to play catch up and constantly in that firefighting mode.
Exactly, exactly. Nobody wants to be under pressure from an investigation. No one wants to, have to go through all of the machinations, with the attorney and the responses and what have you. And again, I want, I mean, I don't want individual board members to be over nervous, because it's not really a matter of personal liability, but it is an issue that you will have to contend with as the leader of the association and the body responsible for all association operations.
Correct. Yep. Made super very important, and it's a must. It's just a must. There's no way around it. For the beginning of things, the people thought many board members are going to come off the board. We haven't had that experience per se. I think many of the board members have actually stepped up. They've done an amazing job of really trying to communicate, hold town halls. So I'm very proud, at least I could say from our client side, how they've stepped up to the challenge. And because many, it was thought at first that board members were just all going to quit and they weren't going to take the responsibility that needed to be done. And at least we've experienced the opposite.
Excellent, excellent. I'm glad to hear that. And I haven't had any defections either. And I hope that continues, because we really do need these valuable volunteers who are willing to undertake their fiduciary responsibilities, and understand the importance of them.
Yeah, and they're undervalued, and our residents don't know it, but at least we see the good side of it. I have a question here, which I lost it with, I believe it was Royal that asked, they have their budget meeting around December 15th. However,
Mhm.
their annual meetings in February. So do they need to waive the SIRS in February? Can they wait in February? Do they have to do it before December 31st?
No. If they have your budget meeting on December 15th, hold a board meeting. I mean, sorry, hold a membership meeting on that same day. So your budget meeting may be at 7 p.m., hold your board meeting at 8 p.m. and have the vote then, because you can't wait till February. After February, your whole opportunity is foreclosed.
Yeah, excellent. I have another question here that asks, what happens if you get a structural integrity reserve and all of a sudden you're not in agreement with a number? Let's just give it like a painting of the building or the structural part. Have you seen any clients challenge that? And what's been your experience?
Well, not as much when it comes to the estimated cost associated with the actual work or improvement. I've seen it where there's challenges to the determination of the remaining estimated useful life. And in some cases, you can provide maintenance records or other reports, and the reserve analyst will take that into consideration and make adjustments. Um, as far as the actuarial estimate of what is going to things are going to cost, I think there are actual programs out there that base things off of an anticipated inflation rate. So that I haven't really seen much of
Yeah.
that.
I know we've seen it from our side where, you'll have a contractor that's on the board and just challenging, let's say, the cost of something. And like Lisa said, most of the companies, number one, they're protecting themselves and with every right they need to, because they're turning in these reports and they don't want to find themselves liable. Also, what you have to factor in is in the softwares that they use, they're also calculating some form of inflation cost. What a roof costs you today is possibly not, well, high probability is not going to cost you the same 6 to 7 years from now. It doesn't mean that you don't challenge someone. Obviously, if you're doing things in a professional manner, at least is the way we say here, it's okay to tell, the organization, listen, why are we here? Why is this number coming up so high? These are the proposals that we've had XYZ. If we did a 4% inflation over 8 years, and just have a conversation with your partner, with the vendor, and have them explain where they came with that number. And then that way you could determine, okay, ultimately you need someone licensed to sign off on the structural integrity reserve study. So they're going to ultimately need to sign off on it. So you could challenge them, but it's ultimately going to be up to them, because that's the requirement.
And it is an interactive process. I mean, again, they're going to come out and inspect the property, but you can provide them with your maintenance records. You can provide them with information that can help them make those determinations. It's just on the actual, and you know what? Even if you have someone that includes the inflation rate, and those those numbers are never set in stone. So you may have a variance at the time you have to do the work. Now, hopefully you have a positive variance, meaning
Yeah.
that you estimated high. Most of the time I've seen that you estimate a little bit low, and that's just because changes in materials or the way that the construction industry does things, may change the costs. And hopefully our construction industry will come up with some great cost saving mechanisms so that 5 years from now, when you do a cooling tower, it will cost actually less than you thought.
We all wish AI could replace a cooling tower, but that's not the case. But
Actually,
no,
that'd be
but I know
great.
what you mean. And listen, construction costs are high, especially here in South Florida, just with all the construction that we have, the amount of people moving in, the shortage of labor. So there's just so many components that play a role into the future cost of what a potential item could be to repair. So it's just many factors. But again, ultimately, I think the conversation just needs to be had. And that way, you can challenge if you feel it's necessary to do so. And with regards to your experience talking here, I know none of us here are real estate mogul, but talk to me a little bit about what are your thoughts, or have you heard anything with regards to, like, let's say, value of real estate? Do you think that this is going to impact positively for our associations?
Oh, ultimately, definitely. Now, I keep on seeing all kinds of reports in the newspaper, on TV. There's fire sales on these condos.
Yeah.
I've been looking. I haven't found anything that's worthwhile. I mean, I haven't found any like major discounts that make it look like a fire sale. So in my experience, I mean, the rates, I mean, maybe the real estate market has adjusted slightly, and that's going to happen in any type of environment. But now, as a result of all these storms, who knows? We may have more demand for available living spaces, or and to your point, as a result of all these storms, I mean, I can tell you that I can definitely predict that the cost of materials is going to be going up, as well as including the cost of labor, especially if people relocated, contractors and workers relocate as a result of all these storms. So, nobody can really predict that the housing market. I just know that there's a lot of demand. People want to move to Florida. They keep on moving to Florida. So there's always going to be a demand for housing in Florida.
Yeah, I think I would agree there. I mean, I think ultimately what you're seeing is, I have seen the same exact reports that all these collapse and all that. I do think that there will be condo terminations. It's part of the process. There's buildings that are just in prime locations that aren't the land is not being utilized the way it should be used. So that's going to
Hmm.
collapse. I don't know if I would directly relate it to the legislation. I do believe some buildings will get collapsed because of the legislation, but I don't know if it'll be something that's so dominant that brings our condo market ultimately down. I do think that you're going to have people that live in associations that maybe shouldn't have moved in there, and unfortunately, they're on fixed incomes, and it's very difficult for them. So they may have to sell it. Those are the unfortunate circumstances. I think overall, there's probably things have stabilized. You're not seeing the increases, but it all depends on the building and how prepared the building. But if you're talking from a long-term perspective, I do think that this is going to benefit our market. As I stated earlier, again, it levels the playing field and it allows people to truly understand what the cost is to live in a condo association. So I think there's going to be in the long haul there will be many benefits.
And you talked about a possible special session. I haven't heard that that really is in the works, but I do
Yeah,
know that legislators are looking at funding mechanisms for distressed homeowners. Like Miami-Dade has a great program where they allocated a amount of money from the dock stamps and the
yeah,
other tax allocations too, and they have a interest-free loan that's available to fund a special assessment for structural repairs. So if you're in the Miami-Dade County, then obviously you want to take a look at whether or not you can qualify for the loan, because it is means tested. And it's a fabulous program. It's a 40-year loan. It's repayable on a stepped up basis depending on your income level. And other counties may want to take that as a guideline for funding programs for special assessments. And then I know that the state legislators are going to be they're going to be high and low for any way that they can assist people that are distressed. I mean, that where payment of a special assessment to maintain the structural integrity of a building is going to be beyond their means.
yeah. No,
So, and then I also think about other funding mechanisms. I mean, there are, if you have equity in your property, you want to take a look at equity loans. If you're a person that would qualify, you may want to take a look at reverse mortgages or the HELOC loan. So, I mean, there are different things that you can look to if you're in that position, but please do so as fast as you can, because, there's only Miami-Dade was only given X amount of funding to do this. They have not exhausted their funding yet. So, get in there with your special assessment information and the contract so that they can see that what you are paying for is actually for the structural integrity of the condominium.
Yeah, and again, as board members, this is where I think communication is key. Hopefully, throughout the past 2 years, I say, when this legislation passed, you've had that communication to at least provide some guidance. Obviously, you can't solve everyone's problem; that's almost impossible. But ultimately, if you could provide some guidance, and also, I highly recommend. I know we do it with our clients. Doesn't always go as we want, but it's inviting your local politician. And, we're not trying to get politics into our associations, but ultimately they're the ones that influence many of the decisions that happen. So just inviting them there, letting the community know that you're not taking an angle on whether they're Republican or Democrat, but more of, look, we want to invite them so they can hear our concerns. They can fight for us and do what they need to do. And if you want to invite the opposing party as well, just to get their perspective and get your message out, then it's important. associations are huge in Florida, and people don't understand the power that we have within our industry just never gets utilized. You have CAI has a stat, I think it's a bit old, they have to update. It's 9 million residents out of the 13 million that live within community associations. So it goes to show the power and the influence that we have. It doesn't get utilized the way it should. But yeah, it's important to get your local politician involved. I know Aventura has done its part to make sure that that their voices are heard. So it's no different that you could do within your community, start local grassroots and have it grow from there.
But I wouldn't anticipate major changes to the requirement to obtain the
Yeah,
milestone inspection and to perform the work that was found to be necessary as a result of that inspection. I also wouldn't anticipate major changes to the reserve funding requirements. So what I hope to expect is some avenues for distressed homeowners to
yeah.
alleviate their financial needs.
Correct. Yeah, there's other things you could influence, like the Corporate Transparency Act, but that's a whole nother webinar.
That's for sure.
Yeah. And with regards to loans, have you seen many associations obtaining loans, or they're going more the increase in or passing a special assessment to catch up? What's been your experience there?
I haven't seen people, well, yes, I have one or two clients that did loans to fund their reserves, but that was even before this law was in effect.
Yeah.
Um, I've seen a lot of associations obtain loans to do actual work. I mean, the work required by the milestone or work that is anticipated in the SIRS. They want to get it done now or as fast as they can. So when the mandatory funding kicks in for them, they're on that longer schedule. They're on that longer timeline, and that makes it a lot easier for their residents. Now, if you have a loan, and you're paying it out over a period of 5, 10 years, I mean, that's an increase in your monthly or quarterly payments, and then you have your reserves on top of that. So, there is still a period of time where your payments will be higher than anticipated, but at least you'll be living in a building with a brand new roof and brand new revitalized or modernized elevators or concrete restoration, new railings, so you're not going to fall off your balcony or anything. Um, Again, it's work. I mean, you got to pay for it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's work that needs to be. There's no other option. You're not going to have a contractor that's going to do it for free. It needs to be done.
Yeah, that's right. And bringing up what you said about the unfortunate circumstance that the West Coast has gone through with two hurricanes being hit, I don't see construction costs easing in any way. And I see costs possibly going up because, from that destruction, there's always positive impacts that come. It helps the construction industry. It helps those markets. Unfortunately, you have to go through that. But for us, for a state as a whole, we'll see what happens next year now with insurance as well. Most likely, I don't see any easing on the construction side. So challenging times are still ahead, but ultimately, as we stated earlier, it's just really plowing through, staying positive, doing what you need to do, and following the guidelines that are provided.
Yes,
So
exactly.
as we wrap up here, Lisa, I don't know if you want to give any last minute tips to our listeners here as we wrap up the webinar.
Okay, well, number one, everyone's got to be aware you have to have your budget adopted 15 days prior to the fiscal year. So many in the past, I know many of my associations had their budget adopted or their reserve vote at the annual meeting in January, February, or March. Make sure you get that budget adopted 15 days prior to the end of the fiscal year. If you do need to reallocate any money around or you do want to waive or reduce any reserve funding, you have to do that before 12/31/24. And if you're going to those associations that in the past have, quote, borrowed from their reserves to pay their insurance premiums, please consult with your counsel about that because that's going to change too. It's going to depend on how you've allocated your reserve funds, what's going to be allocated towards non-SIRS components and what money is going to be available in those accounts, as well as the procedure that you need to follow in order to do that. Uh, Believe me, at the end of the day, like you said, 2, 3 years, everyone's going to be in a far better fiscal position. Our properties are going to be much better capitalized, which means that the value is going to be even higher than it is today. And hopefully it will result in less surprises for those owners, whether they're current owners or future owners, when it comes to the building needs, the building maintenance needs.
Excellent points there. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think for me, it's really I think I always end up on this is the communication is very key. Hopefully, at this point, a majority of you have already done your structural integrities. You've already distributed it. You've done your part. I think continue to communicate of what's to come. For those that are looking to waive it next year, again, as I stated earlier in the webinar, just make sure you're communicating why you're waiving the estimated expectation, even though if you may not have, but like, look, there's going to be a significant increase so that your residents can prepare and do what they need to do. And lastly is really working with your partners. It's important that as you're doing that voting process, if you are going to waive it this year, even if you're waiving the non-structural integrity portion, is contact your attorney. Make sure that they take a second look at the notices that you're doing, because it is going to be a members meeting. CAMs remember, we're not allowed to put the quorum requirements. I know we can, but we're not allowed to by statute. So have the attorney take a second peek at those notices, speak to the board of the importance of them reviewing it and taking a second set of eyes on it. And if you're looking to structure the structural integrity components within your budget, if you haven't done so yet, bring in the CPA as well. That way, you're getting all the individuals that are professionals that deal with this on a day-to-day basis, and you're getting the best opinion, the best advice to do what's right for your community association. Outside of that, Lisa, I wanted to thank you so much for being here today. It's always a pleasure. This was way overdue for a long time. We haven't done one in a while. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your team as well that helped put together, my team that helped put this together as well. And for those of you that are here, we're going to have the video up on YouTube, I would say within the next day or two. And if any board member missed it, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have weekly videos, and we look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.